So before I hand over to our speakers, I just want to say that I really look forward to hearing from the speakers. I think a lot of organisations are really grappling with the question of how they sort of can be meet their charitable obligations, be accountable as an organisation when working in partnership, but also making sure that they don't overburden partners with endless due diligence requirements, and how they can move towards more equitable partnerships. I'm now passing over to our first speakers. So we'll hear first from Hugh and then from Catherine. Hugh and Catherine, it would be great if you could quickly introduce yourself as you speak.
Thank you, Francesca. So just to introduce myself, I'm Hugh Swainson. I'm a partner within Buzzacott's charity and not-for-profit team. So we're looking at governance and partnerships today, and I just want to start off by setting the scene. So looking at the trustee role in overseeing partnerships, and some of the sort of sector backdrop at the moment, in particular the compliance aspects, because it's hard to talk about partnerships without looking at all of the compliance that we have to deal with in the sector and that ultimately gets passed on to partner organisations. So let's start by looking at some of those trustee perspectives. And I think at the moment it's an interesting time to be a trustee of a charity in this sector. There's a lot going on, and ultimately trustees are volunteers. They're people who've usually got day jobs elsewhere, and you may only have, say, 4 to 6 board meetings a year in which to oversee the activities of the charity, albeit with potentially a number of subcommittees. And there's a lot of responsibilities that a trustee has to think about. So if you ask the Charity Commission about the responsibilities in their guidance, they'd set out the legal responsibilities of a trustee, and some of those are set out on the right-hand side of this slide. So it's all about making sure the charity is delivering its purposes for the public benefit, being accountable, managing resources responsibly, and all the rest of it. And so when looking at partnerships, the trustees have to think about all of these responsibilities in that context. And there's also the sector context to consider. Obviously, we're in a situation where in recent years there's been a lot of public scrutiny around the way charities are working, and that public scrutiny is really only increasing because of the media environment that we're all operating in. And the compliance environment is getting more and more. There's a bigger compliance burden all the time on charities operating, which means that compliance environment then gets pushed on to the partner organisations that we're working with. But increasingly in recent years, we've seen a bigger focus on behaviours in the sector, and the way people are working, the culture of the organisation has become a bigger factor. So on my next slide, let's have a look at some of that compliance environment in a bit more detail. So where is all this compliance coming from? Well, unfortunately, it's coming from a whole range of directions. Obviously, the principal regulator is the Charity Commission, so let's look at them first. The Charity Commission in recent years has developed its strategy around compliance, and a lot of this is responding to more broadly in the charity sector, trying to maintain public trust in the sector. And as a result, the Charity Commission is focused more on the policing aspect of its work and for dealing with the kind of things that reduce trust in the sector. So we can see that coming through in recent years with the serious incident reporting framework that's now required for all charities, where things like safeguarding and fraud need to be reported to the Charity Commission, and the response that the Charity Commission is now having to those things being much more significant. But compliance comes from other places as well, particularly funders. Anyone working with funders, particularly some of the large institutional funders, will know the amount of compliance that comes from that direction. But all the time there's more compliance requirements emerging. So recently, for example, we've had GDPR. So all of this together puts together a really heavy compliance environment, which, as I say, then really frames a lot of the work that's done in the relationships with partner organisations. But it's worth just pausing for a second to think about compliance versus accountability, because whilst we have to worry about all of this compliance and the way that we've got to do that, It's important not to forget that accountability and transparency is vital for this sector, and accountability is a really important goal. So I think it's important to have your own values around accountability and transparency and how you approach that, even if a lot of it's ultimately driven by the compliance requirements. So on my next slide and final slide, I'll just look at the trustee perspective. So, so if you could just move to the next slide. What I've talked about so far is all the worries, all the responsibilities that the trustees have to think about, all of the compliance. So how do they actually deal with that? Well, there's a whole number of tried and tested methods. So trustees will approve policies on safeguarding, anti-money laundering, all the rest of it that they'll have in place. They'll have controls such as financial policies, delegation of authority to make sure decisions get made at the right level. There'll be a lot of processes that they want to make sure are in the organisation, such as all the due diligence processes on partner organisations, the reporting and monitoring that goes on. They'll get reports from management on all these issues and be able to challenge management as to make sure things are happening as they should be. And they can get independent verification of this. So for example, through internal audit, to check that the things management are telling them are actually happening. So there's lots of methods to make sure this the trustees and the charity are complying. But again, this all adds really to the compliance environment that we're operating in. So supposing you're a trustee coming into a charity new that works a lot in partnerships, what kind of questions should or might the trustee be asking around the oversight of partnerships? Well, certainly I think some of the points on this slide you'd ask about, you'd say, do we have the policies in place, the controls, the due diligence processes and the checks and all the rest of it? Are all these things in place? But increasingly, we also look more broadly. I've talked about the sort of behaviours that are becoming more important in recent years in the sector and getting the spotlight more. And I think it's not just having the policies. How do you know those policies are put into practice on a day-to-day basis? So the questions we're sort of starting to ask about with partnerships might be more around, you know, why are we having the partnership? What's our role in the partnership? How do we ensure the right relationship within that partnership and deal with power relationships and make sure the people work with the right values and behaviour? And how do we ultimately, how do you drive the culture within an organisation? And when you're working, you know, internationally, potentially across a lot of countries, how do you know that that culture is being delivered correctly across a range of countries? And I think there's more and more processes that people are starting to see to make sure that happens, in terms of focusing on things like whistleblowing and making sure that people can speak up when things do go wrong. So a transparent a culture, but ultimately it's a sort of behaviours right from the top to through the organisation that makes sure that the sort of then the training and everything within the organisation exists to have an environment where you can have you can deal with the risks, whether they come from safeguarding or fraud, and have the right relationships with partner organisations. So as a result of this context, there is a lot of new thinking in the sector, and we're going to hear from 3 organisations about their current approaches to this. But first, I'm going to hand over to Catherine Biscoe, who's going to have a look at some of the perspectives that we're seeing from the sector.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Yes, I'm Catherine Biscoe. I'm a partner in the charity and not-for-profit team at Buzzacott. So what I wanted to do just briefly in the next session is go through the results from the survey that we prepared in advance, and that some of you have kindly filled out before the webinar. And really, we were just asking 6 questions to try to get a view from the sector on, you know, what some of your sort of key concerns and focuses were around partnerships, and particularly those governance aspects that Hugh was talking about. So if I move now to the next slide, and we'll be looking at the results from the survey one by one. So the first question really, we were trying to get an understanding by asking what is most important from you for working in partnership, you know, get an understanding of why partnership working really, and what is driving that with NGOs. And as you can see here, the highest sort of score in response is respect and trust. But then actually quite a bit of variety in terms of the other sort of important factors. So I think really that will obviously depend on the type of organisation that you are, and your sort of key concerns and ways of operating. And I think we will hear more about that in the conversation section later. If we could turn now to the second question on my next slide. So this is talking about what is your biggest governance challenge in partnerships. And I think here it's coming back to what Hugh was saying. We were trying to sort of focus and sort of see if your key concerns and therefore your key focus is around the sort of the compliance aspect, or is it actually around the creating openness, the transparency and the accountability. And as you can see here, actually the majority of respondents really did think it was the latter. Also a significant percentage there concerned about addressing power imbalances, and actually the compliance aspect, really focusing on due diligence, is really less than 20% here in terms of respondees to this survey. Moving on to the next slide. Question 3, this asks what statement best sums up your attitude towards possible duplication of partner due diligence in the sector. So I think even though in the previous question, actually due diligence and compliance sort of scored really low, nevertheless, it obviously is key. It is sort of an essential feature at the moment for being able to work in partnership, being able to sort of satisfy requirements from funders, from regulators and so on. So really with this question, we were trying to sort of understand, actually, is there too much focus on due diligence, and in particular, is there duplication? So are you having, to sort of put partners through, additional requirements because of maybe different funder requirements? And as you can see here, just approaching 50% of people responding to the survey did believe that there should be more sharing of due diligence to reduce the burden on partners. However, the other two answers are quite evenly split. So actually a significant proportion do think that it should be up to each individual NGO to do sort of their own element of proper due diligence, whereas actually also a big significant percentage thinking that the sector needs to completely rethink its approach on partner due diligence. And I'm sure this is one of the aspects that we're going to hear about later on from the speakers. If we could move on to question 4. So do the trustees or those responsible for governance receive adequate information to understand the risks associated with partnership working? So I think here it's pretty much sort of split down the middle almost. Just over 50% don't think that trustees are receiving enough information to sort of understand the risks, whereas actually just under 50% believe that they do. And sort of trying to think about what might be the reason behind this split. I mean, could it be sort of the risk appetite across the different NGOs that have answered yes and no? Could it be the level of sort of monitoring and compliance that's in place in those NGOs that have said yes versus those that have said no? And I thought it would be interesting to know what trustees themselves would say. So for some of those NGOs that responded no, if those responses were entered by management, would trustees also think that was the correct answer, or would they believe that actually they are receiving enough information? So I think it will be an interesting one to explore. It's probably too complex for it to be a sort of a yes or no answer. So it's probably one to explore later in conversation. And then moving on to question 5, and this is asking, do the requirements around partner due diligence and compliance limit our effectiveness as a sector? So again, a yes or no question. Slightly less close this time. So just over 50% actually think that no, due diligence doesn't limit the sector's effectiveness. But also approaching 50% of NGOs think that actually possibly it does. I mean, I suspect that there's probably different sort of levels, I guess, within those sort of yeses and nos. I imagine that most organizations at some point have felt that due diligence does limit their sort of way of operating. They've possibly not being able to work with sort of the best placed local organization because of failing due diligence requirements, and even just simply the sort of the cost and time involved in the process. But also, I guess everyone will have experienced the benefits. It is can be a key decision-making tool, and it can also be used, I guess, to support potential would-be partners to sort of bring their sort of governance and processes up to the next level. So I think again, whether there's likely to be a sort of a change in approach going forward as a sector, this will be an interesting question to explore. And then the final question from the survey, question 6, how would you sum up the sector's attitude to risk when it comes to partnerships? I think this is quite a complex section. I think question. Sorry. I think risk is really, or could be, a whole topic in itself. So really, is the question asking, and when people were responding, were they thinking of the sort of overall organizational risk management in terms of what could shut you down if you got it wrong? So linking back to what Hugh was saying earlier, possibly around some of the regulator requirements, things like safeguarding and so on. Or is it really focusing on a sort of a more practical and detail level? So the kind of detailed risk assessment that you would go through before working with new partners. And should this kind of approach, this process be a one size fits all, or would it be adapted? Should it be adapted depending on the type of organization that you're working with, even where the funding is coming from in particular circumstances? Or actually, should we be focusing on the word attitude? Is that the key word in the question rather than risk? So I really, in terms of the responses, as you can see, about right wins on this one. But actually, there is a very significant 40% of respondents that actually think that the approach of the sector is currently too risk averse. So I suppose this might signal potential changes in approach going forward, and I think is something that probably the 3 NGO speakers will have a lot to say about. So I will now hand over to Eddie to start the conversation.
Thank you, Catherine. So like Catherine and Hugh, I'm a partner in the charity and not-for-profit team at Buzzacott, and we've all worked with organisations working internationally for quite a long time. But what we've seen increasingly is changes in both the structures of those organisations, innovations such as START, who we'll be talking to in just a second, but also within organisations moving their own governance out into countries, and some of the changes in power relationships and dynamics that requires, and the relationships that organisations have with partners really partly reflect that. There's been a couple of comments from both Catherine and Hugh around this not just being about compliance, and I think the key difference really between working in partnership and say subcontracting or subgranting on a straightforward basis is it's not just a commercial transaction. This is about working together towards a common purpose, and a purpose to usually support a population that the partner's a lot nearer to than the NGO based in the UK. I think each of the speakers will have some interesting things to say about how their organisations have tried to deal with that dynamic between having these responsibilities and duties that are imposed by all the things that Hugh talked about, but building effective mechanisms for delivery. And I think to start things off, what I'd like each to do as we go around is say a little bit about their organisation and what their challenges are, but then draw out some of the things that they've done specifically to try and build different partnership models. So Antigone, are you in there?
Yes, hi. Hi, Ed. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks to Hugh and Catherine as well. So my name is Antigone. I'm the governance manager of the START network. And for those of you that don't know anything about it, we are a membership organization. So we're a network of over 50 local, national, and international NGOs around the world. And our mission is to fundamentally change the way the humanitarian system operates, which sounds quite modest, I suppose. And we do that through in 3 key ways, I suppose. So the first way is to trialing new ways of responding to crises. but in a faster and earlier and more proactive way rather than reactively. And also informed by NGO decisions rather than donor priorities. And the START fund, which is our pooled fund, is an example of how that works. But also we're kind of working around bringing innovative practices into the way we work. So around community-based innovations, but a key aspect of our work is also kind of the localization initiative. So kind of the sector-wide, I suppose, move of moving resources and decision-making closer to the front line of crises and closer to specifically national and international organizations in the countries affected by crises. So our members, we work through our members, and our members are also an integral part of our governance. So they're part of our board, our assembly, our committees, and program level decision-making. And we started as a consortium hosted by Save the Children UK and have recently become independent, registered charity in the UK. So I guess in terms of the topic of today, we have wrestled with it quite a bit, especially in recent years and in many ways. And especially when it comes to kind of our initiatives around localization. So I guess the first example is in recent years we have decided to move towards a decentralized network of national and regional hubs. So like a network of network structure in which essentially that would mean fundamentally changing our governance system from that of at the moment, I guess it's quite a traditional membership organization. We have one central board that holds the risk, but then what we're trying to do is move towards more of like a confederation structure where there are multiple entities that kind of share the risk, and they're each kind of independently governed but also connected. And I guess this is quite a big process that it kind of really brings to the fore this sense of like having to balance meeting our obligations as a charity, which at the moment, is kind of like relatively small in the UK, but also ensuring that we grow into an autonomous, a network of essentially autonomous and devolved entities which make locally appropriate decisions independently of each other to the extent possible. So we're still working out the structure actually. But I guess one thing that we found is that one way of balancing compliance and being in equitable partnerships is coming up with minimum common standards that are upheld by everyone and are agreed from the beginning of the partnership. And making sure that they are locally and contextually appropriate, especially if you're working with organizations and entities and networks around the world. And these could be, for example, a common due diligence process for all of the members, across the hubs, or principles around governance and assurance. So, having a shared minimum parameter around the composition of boards, for example, or like the need for a finance and audit committee, let's say. And the other thing we found is that we do tend to talk about risk in kind of blanket ways, but we have realized that it's important to kind of quantify and qualify the different risks of a partnership. No one's denying that working in a partnership has its risks, but it's important to kind of fully understand them, and making sure that your mitigation strategies are in line with the scope and mission, but also the kind of size of the organization and are proportionate. But I think that the main way in which we've tried to address this, we've essentially encountered this issue as well, is in our due diligence system. So as a membership organization, obviously we have to take new members through a process of due diligence. And in recent years, one of our strategic priorities is to diversify the number of local and national organizations that are part of our network. So at the moment, we're quite, I suppose, our membership profile looks quite international NGO. We have local and national members as well, but we're trying to incentivize and make sure that our network can absorb a greater diversity of humanitarian organizations, and
those
not as
to the hubs.
Sorry?
So would each of the hubs have its own set of relationships then with national NGOs?
Exactly. So at the moment we have a global membership. So every member that joins is kind of like the membership is managed at the global level. So they have to be approved by our board and our assembly. But as the hubs are growing, then the membership would kind of devolve to the hub level. So the hubs would manage their own members essentially. But we're trying to kind of have a common due diligence process that is used across the board, which is what I'm going to talk a bit more about now, because I think I think it's quite interesting. So the idea, I mean, at the moment our members work with local partners, but they're kind of downstream partners. So, you know, we pass the funding on to the members, which we have due diligence, and then the member kind of holds the risk for its downstream partners. But we want to bring in local national organizations as direct, equal members in the network. So our previous system of due diligence was kind of like a traditional pass or fail model. So either you pass all of the requirements or you don't. This meant that we could only accept members that meet the highest level of donor compliance, which tends to exclude a lot of organizations that are smaller, that work in other countries, that don't necessarily have the same access to funding or alliances or partnerships, but are often the best place to respond to crises in their communities. So we decided to move to a risk-based model of due diligence, and we've been working with our partner TechSoup on coming up with a tiered due diligence framework. So that essentially assesses organizations within a spectrum of compliance rather than just a pass or fail. So the way it works is there's between 1 and 4 tiers, so with tier 1 being kind of like the least compliant in a way, which they can still join the network, but they don't get any access to funding. Then tier 2 is more kind of meets more of the requirements, but not all kind of that traditional donors would ask for. So then the tiers essentially define an organization's level of access to funds. So tier 2 can access funds, but not as much as a tier 3 or 4, for example. And this is
level of compliance driven by the top level donors' expectations that you're having to pass down then.
Yeah, so to create this framework, we consulted with a lot of our donors, not just DFID, but most of our donors are kind of governments, but around the world. So we consulted with donors, compliance experts, our members and how they do due diligence. So essentially to kind of satisfy the donor risk appetite, we have to kind of make sure that the donor feels kind of comfortable with the amount of funding that goes to these organizations that are not meeting actually their full expectations, I suppose. But then I think, and I'll speak about the challenge of this a bit as well. But essentially what we're trying to do is make sure that even though their funding access might be different, they are still the same. They still have the same kind of rights in the partnership. They still feel like equitable members in the network. They have the same access to voting. They have, they can still be part of our governance. So we don't talk about tiered membership. We only talk about tiered due diligence, so that they don't feel like second-class members just because of the level of compliance. And I guess the biggest challenge here was actually convincing donors to fund those smaller tier organizations, because what we want to do is essentially at least start small and test and evidence our assumption that smaller doesn't mean riskier. And some donors have been more willing to do this than others. So now we've had to create like a smaller subpot of money that just has the funds, only includes funding from the kind of more risk-embracing donors. But the ambition is to eventually convince all of our donors to adopt this approach, so that like all funding could be pooled in one place. I've actually not been part of these discussions myself. It's my colleagues working on the kind of due diligence framework, but I've heard that it was it's very hard, but it's good to kind of find donors that are willing to embrace that and test it. especially in a network where you kind of share the risk already.
Are your regional hubs already there in a sort of tangible form, or is that emerging at the same time as
they're emerging at the same time? Yeah. So we're doing everything at once. So the members are still global, but they're kind of working. Those members that are based in the 5 countries where we have the emerging hubs, you know, they're kind of working in informal networks together to kind of establish their own hub, which over time will become independent, I suppose. And then, sorry, the final kind of bit I wanted to mention about the tier due diligence framework is that we, alongside it, we're also developing a capacity strengthening framework, which would enable members to move up the tiers. So if you're a tier 1 and you want to move to tier 2, there's like a way for you to do that, and you know, either peer-to-peer or, you know, a more targeted, systematic kind of capacity building approach, I suppose. But the interesting thing around this is that we're not just looking at elements of compliance, but we're also thinking through, you know, what makes a strong institution, you know, more broadly, and not assuming that big NGOs have a superior role in this relationship just because they have kind of more traditionally compliant, you know, processes and systems. But yeah, so if you're looking at what makes a strong institution, and obviously compliance is one side, but not the whole story. You're also looking at what others can bring to the table at the same time. So for example, you know, a local organization that's, you know, smaller potentially and might need support to develop certain policies, but they might also be able to demonstrate, you know, they might have like a better system of being accountable to communities when they deliver work. So that's something that they can share and that other NGOs can learn from. So this is, again, another thing that's being developed at the same time. But yeah, I guess that's kind of everything from me. Sorry if I've taken more time than I should have.
Perfect amount of time, thank you. And it sounds really intriguing then, because you're building an ecosystem, really, aren't you? And there must be some challenge in keeping that. I don't know whether it is a balance. You want as much reassurance for people as you can possibly have, at the same time as having as much autonomy for everyone as you can, rather
exactly.
than necessarily having to buy.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And it's the kind of process of trying to develop something from a centralized position to something that's going to develop into something completely different, but also still having those systems and attitudes in place, and you know, drawing from the experience of redesigning our governance to fit this new network of networks structure. You know, we have found that it's important to make those decisions jointly with the future partners, making sure that whatever you develop is appropriate for them, making sure that they feel like they're part of, you know, they're not just joining something that you've created, but that it's kind of co-created with your partners, if it is called a partnership. But yeah, it's really kind of obviously challenging to balance the compliance requirements on the one hand, and the need for the board to kind of have oversight of all of these things going on, but at the same time making space for you know, partners to kind of feed into the process.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out then over the next few years. Thank you so much for that. We'll come back in the Q&A probably with a couple more points. At this point, we'll be moving on to Angela, though, to tell us a bit about All We Can's approach to partnerships. Hi, could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with partnerships and maybe the challenges that NGOs like yourself face in establishing those relationships? I think you're on mute.
Okay, so I'm Angela. I'm Programs Director at All We Can. As an organization, I guess we've been around for 80 years. We hold the Methodist Relief and Development Fund. So we're the relief and development arm of the Methodist Church in Britain. And about 5 years ago, maybe slightly longer, about 6 years ago, we went through a process of change. So part of that change was the name, but I think fundamental to the change was a change in the way that we operate, the way that we do international development, the way that we do partnership. And so there are a number of critical tenets, I suppose, that characterize our partnership model. So the first one being that we became a lot more relational. We were in 20 countries with 50 partners, but a very small group, which meant that really, for the most part, we were giving out grants, but we were not really able to follow up and actually get to know the people that were implementing programs. Our work was very much focused, or our partnership was very much focused on projects, and so we wanted to really move away from that, and became a lot more relational, which meant that we were visiting more, we're picking up the phone more, we were doing video calls, and really getting to understand the partners that were delivering programs. I think early on we recognized that because we don't implement directly, we can't achieve our vision and our mission without partners. So we really put the partners front and center of our work. So we wanted to really get to know those partners at a very intimate level. We then decided that what we wanted to do was to commit to those partnerships long term. So our partnership was not based on a particular program, but really working with organizations in the long term. So we would identify partners, identify potential, I suppose, in partners, in people and organizations, and then we'll accompany them on a journey of development for two aims. I think the first one, to get behind their vision and their mission. And so that meant that we don't necessarily have a sector focus. We don't say to partners, you know, we'll give you funds if you're doing a health program or I don't know, health or water or whatever, or education, but it's really getting behind the whole vision and mission. And so we, and so as I said, we partner long term. And so in getting behind the partner vision and mission, what we recognize is that we needed to then make sure that that mission is very clear, both to us as well as the partner, so that over time we can be able to look back and see just how much we've been able to move together as partners towards bringing up those solutions for the poorest. But I think the other aspect of it as well is that even though we do commit for 10 to 15 years, we want to make sure that after those 15 years, we have left enough capacity behind in that organization, that organization is resilient enough to continue to find solutions to poverty long after all we can is gone. And so that really then shapes the way in which that we work with local partners. Therefore, we develop MOUs, long-term MOUs with partners based on their strategies. In developing those strategies, it's an opportunity for the organizations to really I guess, interrogate and define issues around their own identity, their values, their culture, and then also the ambitions that they have over, say, a 5-year period. And so our grants then would be very much based on the outcomes of that strategy and then the annual plan. So what it is that they want to prioritize year on year. And so you can actually say that our grants are unrestricted, and then partners restrict them themselves. Why? Because we might say to a partner, okay, this year we have 40,000 that's available to you. Now let us know what you would want to invest the money in. It's not then easy money. There's a whole process that goes into us reviewing what the partners are submitting. We have our own internal peer review mechanism. But really what we see is that everything that we are doing, whether it's asking questions, whether we making recommendations, is really to help to strengthen the organization more. So, you know, if we're asking them about how they are designing a program, or what how they're going to measure that, all of that is really to help to strengthen that partner so that they can become better at what they do. So I suppose for us, when we look at issues around compliance, whether it's safeguarding, or whether we look at you know, even due diligence in the way that we identify partners, all of that I think is working on trying to strengthen partners, so that we get to that point after 10, 15 years where they are able to carry on from a stronger base than we found them. And so looking at the way that we work with partners, then it means that our focus is on ensuring that we have a robust and comprehensive partner selection process, because obviously once we have identified the partner, then we're in it for the long haul. And so partners, organizations apply for partnership, not for a project. All right, and so we start with the expressions of interest, with a particular criteria. We have a long list, and then we get those that fulfill that initial criteria to then submit longer application forms. Then we work with local experts in the countries. We work with NGO umbrella bodies. Sometimes we even bring in government department people who, you know, where I suppose in every country, local NGOs have to apply to be registered, etc. So we include a large group of people to sort of, or at least different types of people to help us to identify partners. So if we go into a country and we want, for example, to identify 5 partners, we might then have a short list of 8 partners, and then we undertake what we call validation visits. And this basically means that we're spending up to 2 days with each partner, really getting to know them quite intimately. It means that we spend time with the board, we spend time with senior leadership, we might spend time alone with the leader, we'll spend time with the members of staff, and we'll do a number of different workshops. And it's for us to really be able to get to understand the organization, and looking at a number of different things. So we're looking, for example, at congruence, you know, the vision and the mission that they have. Is that something that we could get behind as an organization? Their charitable purpose, getting to see evidence of, you know, the values and the culture that they say that they have as an organization. We'll look at the organizational character. So we might look at leadership. Who is the person that's leading this organization? Are they trustworthy? Do they come across as being sincere, you know, with integrity? Are they willing and open to learn and to change and to grow? Are they capable? You know, do they have the qualifications needed? We look at governance when we engage with the board. Are they responsive? Are they, you know, do they have the right people on there? Are they active and engaged? Look at staff. Are staff looking? Are they motivated? Are they involved in some decision making? What is the culture that binds the organization together? How do they relate with communities as well? So we might have time for them to show us the communities where they're working. So they would have had to have a track record. So even if it's a brand new organization, we do tend to work with quite nascent, sometimes quite small organizations. But we still want to see that they've started to do something, that, you know, the communities know who they are, what they're about. And in all of it, we're looking at potential. So we're not looking at an organization that's ready-made. Otherwise, then there's no need for that. For, you know, there's no reason for them to partner with us. But we're looking at potential to grow, willingness to learn, and so then everything else that flows out of that is really about building capacity. And so once the partners have been identified, we do undertake quite comprehensive due diligence, because we're not going to just send money. Being good stewards of funds that we receive, We're not just going to send money, even though we like an organization, we believe that, you know, they're the right one organization for us. We will do a financial due diligence, we'll do a governance audit check. And if they fail in the sense that they have weak processes, that's not the end of it. For us, then it's spending time over a 2-month, 3-month period, whatever it takes to get the systems up to the point where we are able then to provide funding. So everything that happens, whatever comes out, is really an opportunity for capacity and growth for that organization. So we will do the due diligence, and then we will have quite a comprehensive and thorough induction. So this is where, you know, we have conversations about, you know, what will partnership look like with All We Can over time? What are our expectations? What expectations do they have of us? And I think it's quite critical at that point, because this is the time that we are also saying to the partners, listen, so far we're the ones that are choosing you. But actually, it's about you choosing us as well, and being willing to work with us, and actually recognizing that, you know, we can't fulfill our vision and mission without you. And I think that's the point where it's really about sharing the power. The partner realizing actually they have a lot of say in this relationship and this partnership, and actually it's all about whatever we do. It's all about really them, you know, becoming better versions of themselves, so that they can be able to continue to find those solutions for the people that we all collectively serve, which are the poorest in their countries. We then take a comprehensive organization assessment. This is really for the partner. So and that then leads into them developing a comprehensive organization development plan. So, you know, it's what are those areas that the organization are seeing need to be strengthened, so that they can be able to fulfill their vision and their mission. And then, as I said before, the development of that strategy, and that is really the what we then get behind over a 5-year period. So over the lifetime of our partnership, you know, we might support partners to develop three strategies, and in each of those we're wanting to start to see growth and change, and that the partner is moving towards their own resilience. So they're able to identify additional funders, and you know, they're looking at financial sustainability. We're looking at strengthening leadership and governance. So I guess in a nutshell, that is the approach that we take. We put a lot of emphasis into identifying the partners, and then everything else sort of is about how we can support that partner, whether it's due diligence or compliance or whatever, strengthening them. We do annual audits, again, a tool that we see for capacity building of the partner. How are they taking on board those recommendations? How are they strengthening their systems based on their outcomes and their findings?
Thank you. That's so interesting, and the key to all of that, I think, and you mentioned that you fundraise rather than you're funded by donors, is that you're in complete control of how you manage the relationships, and you've made the choice to move to a relational model rather than a sort of just pass the funds down model.
Exactly. I think in Hugh's presentation, you were sort of talking about you know, some of the compliance. I know funders are a big one in terms of certain expectation. But you know, obviously, Charities Commission is, you know, really the ones that we having to ensure that we satisfy. So around safeguarding, for example, issues around fraud, etc., which we have to do just like any other organization. But for us, I suppose, so there have been situations where you know, we've received an audit report and it shows as if money has been misspent. I suppose for us, that does not mean automatically we say we're not going to work with that organization. We want to see what is the board doing about it, what is the leaders doing about it. Are they sweeping things under the carpet, or are they actually dealing with the situation, and are they being honest and open, and can we trust that they're going to take the right decisions? And it's only if those things, we're not seeing evidence of those things, that we then might exit prematurely. But otherwise, for us, it's the relationship is really important. And yes, making sure that we are compliant, that we do what is expected, but at the same time, giving people opportunity to learn and to grow and to fail and to learn from those failures as well over a long period of time.
And support was a huge element of that. You did just mention in there, because the thing that's been, I've been wondering, is if your very relational approach and you identify leaders, and often organisations are a bit vulnerable to maybe a change in leaders or a change in people's attitudes. If you do need to exit, how do you manage that one? Because that can be misperceived in the community sometimes.
Yeah, so if we need to exit prematurely, I think what we have said to any organization is that we will give a period of 2 years for exit. And so what we're wanting is, so even if the decision has been made, okay, the leader has changed, we don't think that there's congruence in the vision anymore, they want to go in a different direction that we can't get behind. We still want to make sure that there is an exit plan in place. We want to see how that's going to affect the organization, because I think the last thing that we'd want is they have a new leader, they're taking the organization maybe in a different direction, but then our leaving means that that organization then collapses, or that they haven't been supported to make that transition, and and especially at the community level, that they're able to exit responsibly as well. So that is something that we do. That doesn't mean that maybe we won't come up with a situation where a more abrupt exit is needed. We don't know. We hope that doesn't happen. I think in the cases where we have had to exit prematurely, we have given a lead time of about 2 years to ensure that there's transition that ensures that the organization continues to function after we leave. Thank you.
That helps manage that situation. Thank you so much, and we'll come back to you in the Q&A later.
Sure.
But Derek's waiting in the wings, raring to go right now, I believe.
Yeah.
Hello.
Here he is. Hello. So Derek, you've been putting a lot of thought into the way relationships between partners work, and that partners aren't necessarily a one-way traffic. So it'd be fascinating to hear your thoughts on how relationships between organisations could be modelled differently to achieve better outcomes.
No problem, thank you. So like the other guys, I'll just start with a little bit of quick context. Integrity Action, like All We Can really, like Angela was saying, we're an organisation that doesn't have a presence in any other country apart from the UK. So we totally rely on partners and partnerships to achieve anything. So I think from that point of view, that forced us to kind of keep thinking about how we approach this. And then obviously in that position of needing partnerships, we have a fair few different types of partnerships, consortia, partnerships with local and national civil society organizations in the country of operation. It's basically that latter model that I'll mainly be talking about, where we're the lead and the organization in country, as it were, is sub-granting. Though that model should, of course, be questioned, and I will come on to that. But inevitably at the moment, we do find ourselves in that position, either applying for a bid or actually running a program in that position. So we have tried to question exactly how that works. There's kind of practical and you could say moral reasons for doing that. The practical reasons are that we actually don't feel necessarily that when we're in partnerships like that, that the partner that we're with necessarily feels empowered to voice their honest opinion about what's happening in the program. This is particularly an issue when things are going wrong or things are not going to plan. Organizations in these positions are often financially pressured, and they may feel that they need to hold on to those funds, and if they don't feel empowered to actually say things are going wrong and that things should change, then that's a problem for everyone, really. It's definitely a problem for the overall effectiveness of the program we're talking about. So there's that, but there's also a moral reason here around this idea of localization, this idea that really should an organization like ours, which is only based in the UK, be the one calling the shots and making decisions? No, not really. So that forced us to question all of these things. So thinking about us in the position of a lead, as it were, there were some things that we were thinking about doing and that we've been trialing. And we're in the fairly early stages of this, so I can't give you very much kind of live experience of exactly what it's been like. We've had a little bit of feedback, but we are starting to do these things, certainly in new programs that we're applying for. And hopefully, you know, when we can get those going, to do some new things in the programs when they run as well. The first of those is around due diligence, so that's been discussed already. Basically, we see that as having a kind of power imbalance built into it. And, you know, a lot of this issue around, you know, the partnership is around power and trying to make sure both organizations, all the organizations feel sufficiently empowered to say what they need to say and so on. And we felt like due diligence, the typical way it's done basically comes with this implicit idea that, you know, we, the Northern organization, are checking that you are worthy of working with us and worthy of working with the funds that we have trying to secure here. So we wanted to just try and flip that round a bit and say, well, isn't it also the right of any organization to ask, well, are we worthy of working with you? You, in a sense, as an organization based somewhere else, you're using some capital on working with us. You could say burning capital that you have with your community, that you have with other stakeholders in the community in order to work with us. And if we turn out to be a poor partner and abandon you much sooner than we said we would, then it's very bad for you as well. So I think there's good reason why organizations would want to actually do due diligence on us effectively. But we still are aware of that kind of inbuilt power imbalance that exists in the sector. So we wanted to invite that. So the way we do due diligence now is to proactively send all of the documents and all of the procedures and answers and so on that we would ask them. And you know, we're not disputing for a minute that some form of due diligence does need to happen when a partnership happens. You know, you do need to understand the organizations that you're working with. But we're trying to invite questions from them. So we're sharing with them things like, you know, our governance guidelines, our safeguarding approach and policies and all of that stuff. We actually also took a decision to put all of that stuff on our website. So basically it's kind of easy. We just send them a link and say everything is here, provide a few extra bits of information to make sure it's all up to date. So that's the first thing. The second thing is around partnership agreements. So we're, again, looking back at partnership agreements that we've had, they do seem very one-sided, really, and it's easy to let this creep in without even thinking about it. But things like communications, so, you know, giving permission for use of a logo or something like that, you know, it's often just us, the Northern organisation, saying you must get our permission to use our logo, but, you know, we never for a moment suggest that maybe we should get permission to use yours, and it goes beyond logos as well. So I wrote an article for Bond, which is kind of why I'm here, and I kind of put an example in that article that if anyone hasn't seen, they can go to. But basically, I was saying that instead of actually framing these clauses in a memorandum of understanding as, you know, integrity action will do this and the partner will do this, we just group everything and say the parties. So you use that term to describe everyone in the partnership. And then that means you're automatically not distinguishing between the two. And if you challenge yourself to do that everywhere, then basically you can't avoid being reciprocal in how those things are written. So, you know, we're going back to those and trying to redo them where possible. There's a couple of things that I haven't mentioned in that article, though, that I'd like to mention as well, which we're trying to do. So one of those is around expertise. So partnerships between Northern and Southern organisations often come with this idea that we have to sort of capacity build or share expertise, and indeed that sometimes is needed. You know, if an organisation needs capacity in order to do something and they want that capacity and we can provide that, then that's great. But again, could that work reciprocally? Actually, we work with organisations who know a lot more about, for example, how to work with local government in the sort of countries we're working in. We know very little about that. We'd love to learn more. So trying to kind of share proactively, here are the things that we're good at. Please tell us the things that you're good at. And, you know, we'll exchange and hopefully tell you if there's a gap that we have that you can fill, and vice versa and so on. So that's something we're thinking about doing. And then the other thing is, we haven't done this yet, but in a live program, what about financial reporting and the idea that we ask them to report on their spending in great detail? But if we're being accountable to each other, you know, surely we would share with them all of our spending too, and so on. And it does start to get a bit complicated here. You've got privacy rules to deal with and so on. But basically what we said at that point is that we would consult with the partner and say, you know, here's where we're at. We're thinking about making this reciprocal. What do you actually want? I mean, are we just inundating you with information if we just barrage you with all of the spending that we've got? I mean, you know, that's something that I think we do initially on a partner by partner basis. So those are some measures when, you know, we're the lead, but I did want to just raise this final point around, you know, questioning that model in itself. So this is something I did mention in that article on the Bond website, which was, what about Southern organisations being in the lead? It's not a completely new idea, but I think we're very interested in it because that would properly shift the power. You know, the power is largely, I think, built on where the money is, and because we're the ones who hold the money in a grant, when we're the lead, then that means that the organisation partnering has to do things for us and things that we require. So if we were to flip that round, what would that look like? And actually that kind of looks good for an organisation like Integrity Action, because we see ourselves as a bit more of a service provider, a specialist service provider in the area of sort of accountability, transparency, citizen feedback. Like that's the area we're in, helping citizens to monitor and hold to account key public services that they benefit from. So we kind of have some tools and approaches that we use in that, but we don't have the relationships in country to make that stuff work on the ground. So our role, we almost fit more naturally as a partner in that sense. And I've seen this talked about. There's a donor that some of you will know, the Hewlett Foundation. There's a grant manager working there called David Sasaki, who mentioned this at a conference, and it really struck me. He basically said, wouldn't it be interesting if this became the model that Southern organisations who are much closer to the problems, the issues, the communities, are the ones getting the money, and they go to Northern organisations for specialist skills and capacity and tools that they need. That's basically the model. We exist out here in the North as, you know, specialists in certain things, and even then eventually we would do ourselves out of that role, you know, hopefully by passing on those skills and so on. And the reason I remember him saying this is because it got a cheer. The conference he was at, it really struck a chord and people were kind of whooping and cheering at this. And I thought, okay, could that be a direction to go in? It would take a long time, obviously, but we were interested in this. So this year, I think we've done 3 bids which are based on that. We're waiting on one of them. Sadly, 2 haven't come through, but it's something that we're keen to try more of where possible. I'll stop there if you have any questions anyway, Eddie.
Thanks. Yeah, and it was good to hear the bits I hadn't already caught up with in the article. Thanks. But I guess the question that I did have was in that more reciprocal relationship. Has it improved the way you work? Have you had actual instances where the sort of challenge and the feedback coming to you has made you up your game?
Yeah, I'd say the main way in which it does is that it forced us to look back on all of our approaches and policies and so on through the eyes of another organisation. It's quite easy to look at that stuff just through our own eyes and think, well, let's just do enough to make sure that we have the policies in place and so on. But when we looked at it through the eyes of an organisation that would actually be working with us and thinking, well, is this good enough for them? I think that did make us up our game, yes. Beyond that, though, I'd say because it's quite early days of us doing this, we haven't got a whole lot of learning about how this is influencing us, but hopefully in time that will come to.
Yeah, that would be a good outcome. And I guess the other question then and sadly you said you haven't won one yet, but in terms of getting those relationships where the Southern organisation bids for the funds, what was it them truly them that had gone to the funder to ask for the funds and you'd made all these organisations aware you were there, or are you still slightly taking them to the funds at the moment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in practice it is a mixture of the two. The most recent of those that we're waiting on, I think it was something that had been circulated in our kind of accountability sector and we both identified. And I think we had said, shall we go for this? We think you would be a great lead. And so, yes, there is an element of, you know, us encouraging that, but it was very kind of happily taken on by the partner.
Okay, because I guess the question there is that the reason the Northern organisations tend to get the funds is they're in the same sort of locality, and you're a conduit for money to get to the partners eventually, and it's harder for them to know what funds are available elsewhere, I guess. But, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it depends who we're talking about. Like, we work with some organisations that are, frankly, if you take country out of the equation, they're just way more credible than we are, as in they're bigger, they've got a longer track record, that kind of thing. You know, we're quite small, we've got 10 staff. We work with one partner organisation in Afghanistan, for example, national organisation called Integrity Watch. They've got like 90 staff. You know, their turnover may well be of the same order of ours, but I mean, they're seriously credible people. So if you take country out of the equation, it makes total sense for them to lead a grant, for example, and for us to be the sub. You know, it's almost kind of weird doing it the other way.
Okay, well, I guess watch this space and see if it starts to take off. Well, thanks a lot for that. That was a great contribution. We've come to the time, I think, where we were planning for Francesca to open up for questions, and I think you've had some in already. Yes,
absolutely. Thank you so much to all of the NGO speakers. I think we heard some really great examples of what organisations can practically do. We did have a few questions come in, and the first question I think is for Antigone, but of course anyone can come in as well. And the question is, isn't there a risk that regardless of due diligence tiers, when something goes wrong, the impact will be the same, regardless of the degree of due diligence that is being done? Antigone, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's always a risk, right? I mean, there's no way to eliminate risk, especially, you know, when it comes to working with partners. Like, if you want to eliminate it, you can just go and spend the money yourself. That's literally the only way. But I guess it's kind of like the degree to which you're able to manage that risk, and, you know, by arguably by kind of minimizing the amount of funds based on like the perceived level of risk of an organization of such an incident happening, then you kind of make sure that, you know, you give them the opportunity to be part of the partnership, and like you are also delivering arguably more effective aid, because I mean, again, I think there was a question around this as well. I don't know if it was about this specifically, but, you know, there's an argument around making sure that organizations that work within communities are better placed to respond. So is the risk of, you know, a fraud case bigger than the risk of essentially delivering inappropriate humanitarian aid and responses? So I guess I would look at it that way. And obviously, you know, there's fraud and safeguarding incidents and risks, no matter how big the organization is. And, you know, we all know of recent examples. So I think that's probably what I would say.
And I guess maybe just a quick follow-up on that. So if you, you know, if you have an organization that has been on one of the lower tiers, you know, and that you mentioned the capacity strengthening framework that you have for that, is that in your risk assessments and the way you manage those risks, are those organizations some that you work more closely with to manage the risks? So are they, you know, do you pay more attention to them, or, you know, how do you manage that? Or, you know, do you in a sense?
I guess it's hard to say at the moment because it's quite a new system. So, you know, even the tiered framework itself, we've only trialed it with 12 organizations, which have only recently fully kind of completed the process. And in terms of the capacity strengthening element, that's not in place yet. So it's still kind of being designed. So I guess it's kind of hard to say at the moment.
Great, thank you so much, Antigone. We had another question, and again, anyone can come in on those. Can you tell us how you support partner capacity building? So how do you ensure, I think that was specifically for Angela, how do you ensure your partner's vision and mission fit with your own? And how do you secure donor funding when the grants to your partners are unrestricted? Actually, it's 3 questions, so feel free to take one at a time.
3 in 1. Okay, so in terms of building the capacity of partners, I think I mentioned that we support partners to do organization assessments. So these are self-assessments. A lot of times they have an external consultant who helps to facilitate that process. We use sort of 9 capacity areas, you know, looking at leadership, looking at resources, operations, etc. basically partners sort of see where they are. And then they would develop an organization development plan. Usually that plan then becomes an integral part of their strategy. So it might become one of their strategic pillars. And it just then means that on an annual basis, we're making sure, and they're making sure that they're investing. So when they get there, if we say they have 40,000, how much of that do they want to invest in their own capacity building? Now, there's some things that they, as a partner, can do themselves. They just need maybe a budget to be able to bring people together. They need the space, and time to really grapple with certain things. So in an internal workshop that they can facilitate themselves. So that's, we facilitate that. We provide the budget and space for that. Sometimes they do need external consultants to help them come up and set up a policy or a process or whatever. And again, that can something that they can budget. But we also see that the way that we relate with the partner, the way that maybe we ask questions as we're doing the peer review, or when they do their audits. So the whole process of being in partnership, it's helping to provide opportunities for learning and growth for our partner. Obviously, they challenge us in the same way that we challenge them as well. So yeah, so we use really multiple mechanisms for helping partners to develop capacity, including partner-to-partner learning. So we also provide space for them to get together as a country, also with all the other partners in that country, or in some cases we've even given funding for them to go abroad to a different partner to learn. So really, whatever works and whatever the partner puts across, as long as we agree that it's well thought through and it's going to have the impacts that we hope it will. Again, I think I mentioned in passing, most of our own funding is unrestricted. So it means that we actually in quite a privileged position to be able to work in a very different way. We have a donor who works with us in a similar way, so that helps for that particular donor. But when we engage with trusts and institutions, we do apply with the partner based on the projects that they want to implement. So a lot of the trusts and institutions are not necessarily interested in providing capacity development support, but they will be willing to provide support, for example, for, I don't know, an enterprise development program that a partner might be implementing, or a water or a climate smart agriculture program that they're doing. So there are times when we would do that together with the partner to submit to a donor. Was there another part that I haven't?
So I think you sort of touched on it around the vision and the mission and how you align those with your own and with your partners.
Yeah, our vision and mission is quite clear. So we're about helping people fulfill their potential, and we're about helping to develop these flourishing, resilient communities. So that is clear. And when we then go to identify partners, it's really quite broad then in terms of activities that they can do to respond in order to be able to help to achieve that vision and that mission. And so basically, when we identify partners, we're wanting to understand what the partners themselves want to do, and whether we think that would help fulfill the potential of people, or to come up with these flourishing and resilient communities. So that is basically it. I think most of it then is about whether we think we can work together with the organization, whether they are willing to learn and to grow, and whether they're willing to partner with us, and issues around values and all those things that make a relational model work, I guess.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. We have a question from Jeanette, who's asking what global standards or frameworks can be used to support due diligence to accepted standards, and to try avoid using the lead organization standard as a benchmark. Who would like to come in on that question? Wondered if Derek might have something to say about that.
Not a lot, actually. I'll tell you what, when you said who would come in, I thought you said Hugh would come in.
Apologies.
But no, I don't especially know. And thinking about what we do, we've sort of come up with our own idea, if you like, within the due diligence system I was talking about, our own idea, pretty consistent with what donors are asking for, of course, but our own idea of what we would ask for and what we offer in the two-way sense. So no, I'd be keen to hear if anyone else has any input on that.
I mean, I think that's the sort of holy grail in a sense, having sort of global standards that everyone can apply. But this is something that's the sector's never achieved, basically, and there's so many different perspectives and requirements around due diligence that it is difficult to envisage how it ever would. So, because I think when the conversation we're having earlier around, which was essentially around risk appetite and how do you protect against things going wrong, and what is your appetite for risk in particular areas, and you might, different organisations might have different appetite for risk overall, or particular areas such as safeguarding fraud or data protection. There'll be different attitudes. The due diligence needs to be framed around that risk appetite out there for some way of getting more consistency and standardization around this, because two different funders who've got essentially the same requirements and objectives, but they require entirely separate due diligence requirements, and you have to do the whole thing from scratch essentially, even though the same. So there's a lot of call for more harmonization out there, but I've not seen anything that's really produced that harmonization at this stage.
I had another question from Rachel, and Rachel wondered if anyone has any advice on effective training of partners' own oversight and boards, and especially where boards don't always have the time or the appetite or the skills to review project finance reports or assess how far projects are meeting vision, strategy, and so on. So does anyone have any tips for effective partner board training to make sure that partners can deliver effectively in their role as well? Who would like to take that one? I will just have to start picking on someone. But obviously, if you don't have anything, then that's absolutely fine. Angela, I just saw you come on, so I wondered if you have anything to share.
Yeah, I think for us, what we're hoping to, started to do now, but I think watch the space, and would love to actually learn from you, Rachel, because what we have started to do now is to, when a partner is doing the financial audit, I mean, we're doing that with one of our partners from Uganda, doing a financial audit, that also includes a governance audit. And the hope is that then, in the same way that we get recommendations from an audit, that we can then work through with the partner, whether it's about training, whether it's about putting particular, policy or systems in place. We take a similar type of approach with the governance. And in that way, it's not just something that is coming from us, but actually they're able to say, well, an independent auditor came and did this. And many times as well, we then work, if we're not going to use that same auditor, if it's a financial audit, for example, then they sort of work with the partner to strengthen those areas where they've made recommendations. So we're hoping to take that a similar type of approach of engaging boards in that way. But certainly these next 5 years, we do want to focus much more on leadership and on governance. So I've shared my email address. I can share with you our partner assessment assessment worksheets. If you can then share with us how you've been doing your training of boards.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. I have another question around institutional donors, and how can we assure that institutional donors, with institutional donors, the responsibility on due diligence is not just a tick box exercise, but a highly risky exercise for those that work with local partners. Does anyone want to come in on that one? Hugh.
So I think it sort of matches with a couple of threads that we're sort of talking about earlier around sort of compliance versus accountability, and really sort of framing what internally articulating in the organisation your values around accountability and the importance of that, so that because it is easy to, once you get compliance from so many different directions, to start seeing it as a tick box exercise. So really having internally in the organisation articulated what you think is important around accountability is important. And then it sort of comes back to this thread of risks that we've been talking about. So before entering any of these sort of processes with partners, to sort of really consider risk and what you're trying to protect against, because we've already talked about things going wrong. You can't completely protect against that, but you can manage down the risk through some of these due diligence exercises and other measures. And so it's a case of really focusing on what risks you're trying to manage, and what due diligence is going to make that the most effective, which I think would help focus the mind in terms of taking it away from being a tick box exercise.
Great, thank you very much, Hugh. I think we'll take one more question before we come to the end of the webinar, and this is sort of a broader question from Jeff, and going right back to the beginning of the webinar when Hugh and Catherine were sort of setting the scene. And the question is, mindful of the responsibilities trustees have, should they be specifically qualified, and should they be offered remuneration? Perhaps Catherine, Hugh or Eddie want to come in on this question.
I'm happy to start off. So, I mean, obviously the role of the board is crucial in any organisation. So this is a really important question. Whenever we unpick when things go wrong in organisation, it's the board has a big influence on that, and so it's crucial that the right standards are being set at board level. So that sort of experience of the board is really important. And the way we see people addressing this is firstly by a sort of skills review on the board. So to regularly, potentially on an annual basis, doing a skills assessment of the board to make sure that it's still appropriate. And it is something that needs to be done on an ongoing basis, because the organisation can change in its operations or the compliance requirements, and you may need to bring on new skills that you don't have currently. So making sure the skills base is right is really important. And then the other aspect is sort of reviewing board effectiveness. So having that sort of self-challenge over whether you're actually achieving what you need to as a board, that you're managing to manage risks, outcomes, whatever it is, effectively, and being self-critical. And obviously boards do on a less regular basis sometimes get independent input into this, so sort of governance reviews, that side of things. The Charity Governance Code sets out a lot of good guidance around this. So if anyone's not sort of had a look at the Charity Governance Code, you can just Google it, very easy to find. It's quite an easily accessible document, so well worth a look there. But I think it's also about spreading those skills across the right sort of subcommittees. If you've got a subcommittee structure, obviously you've got an audit committee, you want someone with that risk sort of background, that kind of thing as well. On the remuneration side, should they be remunerated? I mean, that's a big debate really at the moment, and I'll perhaps leave others to get into that. But it's this whole concept that the responsibility is just continuing to increase for these volunteer trustees. So should there be remuneration for board members, or perhaps the chair, is a debate point.
Yeah, I would just say that I might have asked a different question from Jeff about the absolutely endorse as far as volunteer trustees are concerned, but actually the full-time people who are already in the way charities are governed aren't put in the position of being board members, and I think that's probably something we should be looking at, full responsibility for these things.
Absolutely, and I think it's also something that we were thinking about for one of the webinars that we have coming up in the future. I think we will leave it at this here now. Thank you everyone for your contributions. I think I've learned a lot, definitely, especially from sort of the NGO examples that brought the topic to life and sort of helped us think about what organizations can really do differently. And I wanted to just mention as well that we would love to hear what you thought in the chat, it's just an opportunity for you to share feedback on the webinar itself, but also tell us about any other topics that you would like to hear about. So please do take a minute or so to follow the link and let us know. We have, I just briefly mentioned, but we have 2 more webinars planned later this year and early next year in the series on governance together with Buzzacott, so do look out for those. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will share the recording of the webinar as well as the slides as well. So thank you very much for everyone who joined us today, and bye everyone.